The forest stretched endlessly, towering trees casting long shadows under the dimming sky. The trip was supposed to be a bonding experience. His father's police friends had invited him along for a weekend of adventure. At first, it seemed like an honor, an opportunity to be around seasoned officers who had seen the darkest corners of the world and come out unshaken. But something about the way they carried themselves made him uneasy. Their laughter was too loud, their glances too knowing, as if they shared a secret he wasn't meant to understand. They reached the campsite just before sunset. The officers moved with practiced ease, setting up tents, gathering firewood, securing the perimeter. He helped where he could, but his presence felt out of place. They weren't unkind, yet there was a distinct feeling that he was an outsider among them. As darkness settled in, they gathered around the fire. The flickering flames illuminated their faces, casting deep shadows in their eyes. One of them, a burly man with a scar along his jaw, began telling a story about a criminal who had escaped into these very woods years ago. "Never found him," he said, tossing a stick into the fire. "But some say he never left." Still watching, waiting. Laughter followed, but it didn't feel natural. There was something off about it. Another officer, sitting directly across from him, smirked. "You scared yet?" He shook his head, forcing a chuckle. "It's just a story." The officer leaned forward. "Is it?" The group fell silent for a moment. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant rustling of leaves. Somewhere in the darkness, an animal let out a sharp cry, breaking the tension. He excused himself to his tent, needing a moment away from the atmosphere. Zipping up the entrance, he lay down, listening to the muffled voices outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Their conversations carried an undertone, something unspoken but present, lurking beneath the surface. Sleep didn't come easily. The ground was hard, the air too still. Then, a noise. Faint footsteps outside his tent. Slow. Deliberate. His breath caught. Someone was walking around the campsite, but they weren't talking. The steps stopped just outside his tent. He lay frozen, heart pounding. Silence. Then, a shadow moved past. He exhaled slowly, waiting for the tension to ease, but it didn't. He didn't feel safer in the silence. If anything, it was worse. A low chuckle drifted through the night. Not from the fire. Closer. His fingers tightened around the edge of his blanket. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination or if someone was still standing just beyond the thin fabric of his tent. Watching. Waiting. The morning air was crisp, but the unease from the night before still lingered. He stepped out of his tent, scanning the campsite. The officers moved around casually, preparing breakfast, talking in low voices. If anyone had been walking around last night, they weren't acknowledging it. He hesitated before joining them, forcing himself to act normal. One of the officers, the same one who had smirked at him the night before, handed him a cup of coffee. "Sleep well." He nodded, though his body told a different story. His father wasn't here. He had stayed back due to work. That left him alone with these men, who were friendly enough, but something about their camaraderie felt too tight, like an unspoken agreement hung between them. "We're going hunting today," another officer announced, slinging a rifle over his shoulder. "You coming?" There was no real choice. He nodded again, and soon they were trekking deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, the light struggling to filter through. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to know this was no place for noise. One of the officers walked beside him, unusually quiet. Then suddenly he pointed at something in the distance. "See that?" He followed the direction of the officer's finger. At first, he saw nothing but trees. Then movement. A figure, deep in the woods, barely visible. It wasn't an animal. It stood too still, watching. His stomach tightened. Who was that? No one answered right away. Then, the officer next to him let out a low chuckle. "Probably nothing." The words felt empty. He looked again, but the figure was gone. His heartbeat quickened. The group pressed on, weaving through the thick undergrowth. Time passed in a strange way, the minutes stretching, the air heavy with something unspoken. Then, someone from the front of the group stopped. "Where's Carter?" Heads turned. Carter, one of the officers, was gone. His chest tightened. They had been walking together, yet no one had heard anything. No call for help. No sound of struggle. One of the officers cursed under his breath. "He was right behind us." They fanned out, calling his name. The silence that followed was suffocating. After a while, another officer exhaled sharply. He probably wandered off. He knows his way back. It didn't make sense. These were trained men, disciplined and sharp. They wouldn't just wander off. Something was wrong. They started back toward camp, but the unease clung to him. It wasn't just Carter's disappearance. It was the looks the officers exchanged when they thought he wasn't paying attention. Like they weren't surprised. Like they had expected it. His pulse hammered in his ears as they made their way back to camp. No one spoke about Carter. No one even mentioned searching for him. It was as if he had never existed. The silence felt heavier now, filled with things unsaid. They reached the clearing, but something was wrong. The tents were still there, the fire pit untouched, but something felt off. He scanned the area, trying to pinpoint it. That's when he noticed it. One of the bags was missing. Carter's bag.
His throat went dry.
Someone had already erased him. The officers moved as if nothing had happened, but he caught glimpses of their sideways glances, their hushed conversations just out of earshot. He felt like an intruder, like he had stumbled into something he was never meant to see. Needing air, he wandered toward the edge of the clearing. The forest loomed, thick and uninviting, but the silence of the camp was worse. He had to get away, even if just for a moment. That's when he saw it. A little further in, hidden between the trees, a dark shape slumped against a fallen log. His breath hitched. He stepped closer, heart pounding. It was Carter. Motionless. Eyes open but empty. Panic surged through him. He turned to call for help, but a hand clamped over his mouth. Strong. Unyielding. A voice whispered in his ear. "You don't need to see this." Terror locked his muscles as he was pulled back. He struggled, but the grip was iron. He was dragged away from the body, deeper into the forest, away from the others. His thoughts raced. Was this a test? A prank?
No.
The fear in his chest told him otherwise. They stopped near a thick tree. The officer who had grabbed him, the one who had handed him coffee that morning, released his hold, but didn't step back. His eyes were calm, too calm. "Listen carefully," the officer said, voice low. "You're going to walk back to camp and forget what you saw. Understand?" His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, but his body wouldn't move. The officer tilted his head. "Say it."
His mouth was dry.
I didn't see anything." The man smiled, satisfied. "Good." He walked back in a daze, his limbs feeling disconnected from his body. The camp looked normal again, as if nothing had changed. As if Carter had never existed. The others barely glanced at him when he returned. Someone cracked a joke. Someone else laughed. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed Carter whole. And now it was waiting to see if he would be next. The ride home was quiet. No one mentioned Carter. No one looked back at the forest. It was as if the entire trip had gone exactly as planned. But he knew the truth. He had seen it. Felt it. His father was waiting when they arrived. The officers greeted him like old friends, laughing, exchanging stories, acting as if nothing had happened. He forced himself to smile, to play along, but his skin felt too tight, his body trapped in a secret he didn't ask for. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed every moment. Carter's disappearance, the missing bag, the officer's grip on his mouth, the cold warning. He wanted to believe it had been a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. But he knew better. Morning came, but the feeling didn't fade. He had to say something. He found his father at the kitchen table, flipping through the newspaper. There was something weird about the trip, he started, testing the waters. His father didn't look up. "Yeah?" He hesitated. "One of your friends, Carter." His father's hands stilled on the paper. A beat of silence. Then slowly he turned the page. You had a good time, right? His stomach dropped. The message was clear. His father knew, and he wasn't going to talk about it. The walls felt like they were closing in. He wanted to press, to demand answers, but his father's expression was unreadable, a mask perfected over years in uniform. That evening, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You kept quiet, right? His breath caught. He stared at the screen, fingers frozen. The number wasn't saved, but he didn't need to guess who it was from. Seconds later, another message.
Good.
He turned the phone over, pulse hammering. They were watching. He thought about Carter's empty eyes, about the way the others had moved on so easily. He was supposed to do the same. Forget.
Pretend.
The next morning, he overheard his father on the phone. A casual conversation, low and calm. But one sentence stuck in his mind. Yeah, everything's taken care of. He walked away before he could hear more. It didn't matter. The message was clear. Carter was gone. And he was never supposed to ask why.